head SRMC Chennai, and currently now an honorary faculty at at Bichevadia Hospital. Dr. Priya ma'am, we have made you the co-host. You can start sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Bhakti.
Yeah, it's nice to have Dr. Priya talk to us. The student answered very well, I must say, on biliary atresia. Viva was good. And Dr. Priya is going to take us ahead. I think she's got the maximum number of cases if anybody is done. Her father, late Professor M.S. Ramakrishnan, was my teacher. And I remember in 1978-80 when he did the first Kasai at the Children's Hospital, Dr. I.C. Pathak came as the examiner. Oh, he said, oh, Ramakrishnan, you got wonderful results. Even in those days, we used to have, but we have come a long way. As Dr. D. Cruz said, no, biliary atresia is Kasai plus transplant. But Priya has done a lot of work along in the last 10 years, and she's modified the operation in some innovative ways. So let us hear from her own experience. So the youngsters will benefit, and biliary atresia is not all that bad as we all thought. Over to you, Priya.
I know you're not able to see me, but you will be able to see me in a minute. We're just having some camera issues. So I'm here to not really to teach you about biliary atresia, but I'm here to dispel the myths about biliary atresia, myths that have been in our mind for a very long time. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, ma'am.
We can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Yeah. Unmute yourself.
I unmute.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Hello, Priya ma'am. Ma'am, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Can you see me, guys? Hello?
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah, we can see you and hear you.
Can you see me and hear me now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, all right. Let me just open it. I don't know. The Zoom is very uncomfortable because, especially during the daytime, because we don't know which is the best way to show ourselves to you. It seems like I'm still in the dark, but as far as biliary atresia is concerned, none of us are in the dark. There is so much information available, and I'm really here to dispel the myths, like I said, that the popular myths that exist about biliary atresia. You all know that biliary atresia is a progressive obstructive cholangiopathy which affects the biliary tract in infants. It causes cholestasis, jaundice, and ultimately cirrhosis. Now, you're all young trainees, young surgeons who are going to go out into the world and practice pediatric surgery. You need to have a clear idea about what you're dealing with when you see an infant with jaundice. If there is any confusion about how to proceed, this is the very first stage. A baby comes to you with jaundice, you have to be crystal clear in your thought process about how you're going to proceed with this baby. If there's any confusion at this stage, there's no point taking this any further. So I'm going to try and clear the confusions that may exist at this stage when you first meet this baby. Before that, I want to give you an idea about what we're talking about. As you can see, the normal biliary tract has a bile duct, a hepatic artery, and a portal vein. In biliary atresia, there is expansion of the portal tract. So I've shown you what I mean by expansion of the portal tract. You can clearly see the difference that in the patient with cholestasis, the portal tract is expanded. So first you need to understand this so that you have a visual image in your mind when you see the child. So when you see the child, you're not just looking at the child, you're looking at the child's liver and you're looking at the histology of that liver. So this is how an expanded portal tract will look. Now, this is just some statistics for your theory exam. Biliary atresia incidence 1 in 18,000 live births, probably as high as 1 in 4,000 live births in China. No cause has been identified thus far, fatal within 2 years if untreated. And we come to the most important point. you need to evaluate jaundice which is present for more than 14 days. So beyond the period of physiological jaundice, even if the jaundice extends for 15 days, 1 day beyond the period of physiological jaundice, you need to assume that this child has biliary atresia unless proved otherwise. So this is some food for thought. I'm asking you to err on the side of over-diagnosing biliary atresia rather than missing it. So if there is jaundice for 1 day more than the period of physiological jaundice, please suspect that this child has biliary atresia and exclude the other causes of cholestasis and proceed to a perioperative cholangiogram and if necessary a Kasaya motor endoscopy. This is a statistic which you may all know. 50% of all liver transplants is for biliary atresia. So our job as a pediatric surgeon is to keep the baby away from the transplant surgeon. That is our goal. Okay, there's 50% of liver transplants being done for biliary atresia. Our goal is to reduce that 50% and make sure that most children get away without transplant. It's a lofty goal. It's a high ideal. It's difficult to aim, but unless you aim that high, you will not reach halfway. So now, the anatomical classification of biliary atresia, there is 3 types. Type 1 is when the porta hepatis is patent and the common hepatic duct is patent and the cystic duct is patent. Type 2A is when this common hepatic duct is obstructed but the porta hepatis is still patent. Type 2B is when the porta hepatis alone is patent and everything else is obstructed. Type 3, which is the most common form, is when everything is atretic, including the ducts at the porta hepatis. Now, much more important than this anatomical classification is the phenotypic classification. Type 3, as you can see here, this is the commonest form of biliary atresia that we encounter in our daily practice. More important is this phenotypic classification where biliary atresia has been divided into 4 groups. The syndromic biliary atresia group, 7 to 10% of all biliary atresia is BASM, biliary atresia splenic malformation anomaly. This is, the incidence is probably much lesser in our part of the world than it is in the western part of the world. I would say put the incidence at about 3 to 4% for BASM in India. The second variant is cystic biliary atresia, where there are cystic changes in the otherwise obliterated extrahepatic biliary tract. This cystic PA again is extremely rare. It's only 8%, probably even lesser in our part of the world. The third is CMV-associated biliary atresia. I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail later on. The fourth variant is the commonest type, is the isolated biliary atresia, where the children come at different stages of progression of liver disease. The histology of biliary atresia is this is a typical picture where there is expansion of portal spaces due to ductular proliferation and inflammatory infiltration. There is bile plugging in the ductules and there is hepatic giant cell transformation. This is stage 1. Okay. Now I heard a discussion going on about the grades of fibrosis. So the biliary atresia fibrosis grading is 3 grades. This is grade 1 where there is expansion of portal spaces. Grade 2 is when those portal spaces start to unite with each other. So that's called bridging fibrosis. Grade 3 is when these portal spaces unite with each other and form nodules. So that is grade 3, that's micronodular cirrhosis. So it's very easy to understand if you remember that picture I gave you in the very beginning. So the portal space first expands, that's stage 1. The 2 spaces unite, that's stage 2. And when the union is established, it becomes cirrhosis, that is stage 3 or grade 3. Now the etiology is a combination of many factors. Some say some children have a definite viral etiology. CMV is the virus implicated. Now, whatever the etiology is, whether it be viral or whether it be a genetic predisposition, the etiology sets off a common cascade of immunological responses. The immunological responses includes an inflammatory response where cytokines and interleukins are secreted, and then this is mediated by the Th1 helper cells. And in addition, a fibrotic response is mounted where the hepatic stem cells themselves become alpha smooth muscle actin producing cells, and they produce alpha smooth muscle actin, which makes the were fibrotic. So there is an inflammatory response and the fibrotic response. What triggers this response, we don't know. We probably think it's a virus. It may be other environmental factors. It may be also genetic predisposition. So all we can say for now is that biliary atresia is multifactorial in origin. Pathogenesis. So the cholangiocytes, you will remember the picture I showed you in the beginning, the cholangiocytes, they are immature, and when they are attacked by this inflammatory response, they rupture and there is bile leakage, and as a result of that bile leakage, that inflammatory response further increases, and because of that, fibrosis happens, and so on, the disease progresses. Now, when I started working with children with biliary atresia, this classification was thought to be important: early onset and late onset biliary atresia. Early onset biliary atresia is when there is the child has a period of physiological jaundice, following which the jaundice persists. There is no jaundice-free interval. This means the disease started fairly early on. Late onset biliary atresia means there may or may not be physiological jaundice. After that physiological jaundice, there is a very clear interval where the baby had no jaundice. The baby passed yellow stools, and subsequently the stools became pale, which means that is a late onset jaundice, which means the disease started late. I'll talk about this a little later. Clinical features, you all know: jaundice, high colored urine, pale stool, and a direct bilirubin, which is high, more than 20% of the total. Now, clinical features, again, same clinical features. The postnatal weight gain and development is normal. Antenatally, the ultrasound is normal in most children. Early in the course, the stool may be pigmented. Later, it becomes acholic. The liver is firm. The spleen is not enlarged. There is no ascites. The children have lab values will show a coagulopathy and a raised INR, increased INR. Serum bilirubin is high. GGT levels are raised, and there are clinical features of cirrhosis by the time the baby is 70 to 80 days of age. Differential diagnosis is just a list that I'm going to read through. This is not the focus of my talk. Neonatal hepatitis, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, giant cell hepatitis, cytomegalovirus hepatitis, Alagille syndrome, cystic fibrosis, obstructed choledochal cyst malformations, that should lead to spontaneous perforation of the bile duct, and inspissated bile syndrome. Now, you will be asked when you have a baby with jaundice, you have to distinguish between neonatal hepatitis, what is known popularly as neonatal hepatitis, and biliary atresia. Neonatal hepatitis is caused by all these factors I mentioned previously. Okay, neonatal hepatitis is a result of all of these, any one of these diseases, and those children usually have either have evidence of sepsis, they are sick, or they have dysmorphic facies, which means they are part of a syndromic. They have some other syndrome which is causing jaundice. And their stools may not be continuously pale, they may be intermittently pale. Whereas in biliary atresia, there is no family history of genetic disease. The baby is well, the baby is really well, and the stools are pale. And most importantly, the bleeding tendency can be corrected by vitamin K. I have encountered babies where they were not able to measure the INR. The INR was so high. I have also got some babies in my series who presented with head bleeds because of the high INR. In all of those babies, if it is biliary atresia, 3 doses of vitamin K, the INR will come to less than 1. I can guarantee you that. So that is one way of identifying biliary atresia and saying that it is different from neonatal hepatitis. The INR will come down, even if it is unrecordable in the beginning, because this can be corrected by vitamin K. Investigations, ultrasound, all of you know that, liver biochemistry, viral serology. Again, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit of detail later on. Percutaneous liver biopsy. HIDA, I'm putting it here just to tell you, do not do it. It is a waste of time. It's inaccurate. You need 5 days to infuse phenobarb and infuse the child for the HIDA, and then it takes another day to report. And if there is no excretion, you don't know if this is, you cannot say for sure that this is biliary atresia. You cannot say for sure that this is not biliary atresia. So you're left, there's absolutely no point doing the HIDA. I feel very strongly about it. It's a waste of money and a waste of time. ERCP and MRCP are mentioned in the textbooks. ERCP is difficult to do in such a small baby, and MRCP is not accurate, it's not feasible. Perioperative cholangiogram is the gold standard. But, coming back to what Ashley said in the teaching session, if you are able to provide, if your histopathology services are good, from the liver biopsy, from the GGT, and from the ultrasound, you can diagnose biliary atresia. You do not need to do a Baroque cholangiogram. But I would not encourage you to go down this path. This is for centers that deal with biliary atresia all the time. So in our center, we do a liver biopsy. And in the liver biopsy, our pathologist will say with certainty that this is biliary atresia or that it is not biliary atresia. In addition, we look at the GGT. The GGT is high and the liver biopsy shows biliary atresia. It is for sure biliary atresia. The third thing is ultrasonography. Now, ultrasound-wise, it's the old triangular cord sign is, you have to throw it out the window. There are so many other signs. I would recommend you to look at the literature and look for papers about this. There are so many other signs which can be used to diagnose biliary atresia, right from the shape of the gallbladder to the shape of the portal tract. You can grade and diagnose biliary atresia from the ultrasound. So in the UK now, with an ultrasound and with the GGT value and with the liver biopsy, they are diagnosing biliary atresia without doing a Baroque cholangiogram. And we are kind of going in that same direction ourselves in our institute. But I would not recommend that for people who do biliary Kasai surgeries every now and then. I would recommend that you stick with the gold standard, which is perioperative cholangiogram. The treatment, as you all know, is a sequential strategy, combining Kasai portoenterostomy as the first line, and if the Kasai fails, you do a liver transplant. Extended Kasai portoenterostomy, you first exteriorize the liver by dividing the left triangular ligament. Now, we are now currently in patient number 106 in our series. We have started doing this in March of 2013. Any problem, guys? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So I started my interest in biliary atresia started in 2013, and to date we have performed 105 Kasai operations. We do the same kind of surgery, the same post-operative care, the same pre-operative workup for every single child, and I think that's very important to do, and that probably contributes to the success significantly. Now, what I do is I always bring the liver out. I divide the left triangle ligament and flip the liver out. Then the vessels are looped and retracted, like the postgraduate said earlier. The vessels are looped and retracted, and the portal plate is exposed. And then I excise the portal plate from the right corner. That's called the innominate fossa. The portal vein in the right bifurcates into the anterior and posterior branches. The anterior portal vein drains. Goes into sector 5 and 8, and the posterior branch of the portal vein goes into sector 6 and 7. So where the place where this bifurcates, that's called the innominate fossa, and normally that is where the right branch of the hepatic duct enters the liver. So you have to imagine where the hepatic duct would have been and go at those particular points. So this is one point on the right side. On the left side, the hepatic duct, left branch of the hepatic duct, inserts at the point where the portal vein, the left branch of the portal vein becomes the umbilical vein. That's called the left Rex facies. So you have to go from the right to the left between these 2 points and excise everything in between. And then this triangular area must be put into the hepaticojejunostomy like a funnel. So literally the hepaticojejunostomy comes and covers this area like a funnel. So the anastomosis is done to the caudate lobe on the top, to the quadrate lobe on the top and the caudate lobe below. Literally, you take bites in the Grison's capsule of the quadrate lobe and Grison's capsule of the caudate lobe, not on the portal plate. The portal plate just goes into it and this comes over it like a funnel. Now, this picture, I don't know if it's clear. Suffice it to say that the red vessel loops are around the arteries. The blue vessel loops are around the portal vein. 3 denotes the portal plate. So that's how much of the portal plate you need to expose. You really need to retract these vessels down and expose this much of the portal plate and start excising. Post-operatively, now one more word about the surgery. We do not use diathermy because when we excise the portal plate, we will be exposing microductules, and those microductules can get damaged by transmitted heat from diathermy. So we do not use diathermy anywhere near the liver. We tie off everything that is suspicious with Vicryl ties and divide and then approach the portal plate. Post-operatively, IV antibiotics, IV fluids, NG suction for 5 days. Our antibiotic of choice is Piptaz. We start TPN from postoperative day 2 and orals from postop day 5. The reason we give TPN from postop day 2 is even though the albumin is normal, these livers are compromised and these children tend to have ascites early on during surgery. This can be avoided by giving just 2 or 3 days of TPN, even if we give albumin, it's enough. And when we discharge, and we give prednisolone to all of our children. Every single one of our children gets prednisolone, high dose prednisolone, 5 milligrams per kilo. In the series of 105 patients, only 20 patients did not get prednisolone, and in those patients, the results was dismal. So we give 5 mg per kilo prednisolone, and it's a taper which finishes at 6 weeks. And we discharge the children on antibiotic chemoprophylaxis to prevent cholangitis, rotating antibiotics. 2 weeks, one antibiotic, 2 weeks, another one, and this continues for at least 6 months. Complications, cholangitis. 30% of children, 30 to 60% of children can have cholangitis. Now, as far as I'm concerned, cholangitis is a good thing. Cholangitis means the channels are open and bile is draining because only the channels are open. If something is coming out, something can go in. The bacteria are going in. The channels are open and bile is draining. So, in our series of over 100 patients, I've seen cholangitis only in children who cleared jaundice. Children who don't clear jaundice don't get cholangitis. And if you get cholangitis, there's no reason to panic. Admit them and treat them with the appropriate antibiotic for at least 2 weeks. You will not be able to culture bacteria in the blood. Only less than 30% of children will have a blood culture which is positive, but there will be evidence of pale stool, and you have to really give antibiotic till that stool turns normal in color. Now there are Japanese studies to show that you can use steroids during this period to reduce inflammation. So if they're using steroids to reduce inflammation during cholangitis, there is no reason to stop the steroids that the baby may be on during these episodes of cholangitis. We do not stop steroids. We continue to give steroids through the episode of cholangitis because the baby is admitted under us and monitored and given antibiotics. This, again, needs early detection and treatment. The pathogens are E. coli, Pseudomonas, and Enterobacter, and characterized by fever and pale stools. There are signs of septicemia, elevated C-reactive protein, leukocytosis, based bilirubin, liver enzymes, and antibiotic treatment for 2 weeks. The other postoperative complication is a portal hypertension. It's not really a postoperative complication, it's progression of disease. As the liver disease progresses, 30% of children in whom the Kasai fails will have variceal bleeding. And even in children who have cleared jaundice, variceal bleeding can occur after 2 to 3 years if the liver disease progresses. So you need to do surveillance endoscopy and banding on a yearly basis. Now, how do you evaluate the outcome of a Kasai photoendostomy? Clearance of jaundice, if the bilirubin becomes less than 2 milligrams or 1.5 milligrams per deciliter, whatever you use in your institution. If there is alleviation of hepatic fibrosis, we assume there is alleviation of hepatic fibrosis. We do not do a repeat biopsy. Successful prevention of ascending cholangitis by giving antibiotic prophylaxis. And then you evaluate your surgery outcome by native liver survival over a long period of time. 50% of infants with biliary atresia will clear jaundice, and provided the surgery is done by appropriately experienced surgeons, and provided the surgery is performed prior to the onset of decompensated liver disease. So when do we exclude children from a Kasai? Like Ashley said, we exclude the children if they have hypoalbuminemia and an uncorrectable coagulopathy. These are the only 2 signs that show us that the child is in synthetic liver cell failure. So only if there is synthetic liver cell failure do we not do a Kasai. We do not really, the age is not really a criteria for us, because up to about, I believe, the oldest child in my experience has been about 154 days old who underwent a Kasai. In literature, about 100, they've done Kasai even as late as 160 days. Oreo Kasai himself, in his series of patients, 20% of patients who were older than 120 days at the time of Kasai cleared jaundice. So listen to me very carefully. 20% of patients who were older than 120 days at the time of Kasai cleared jaundice, which means just because the age should not be a cutoff criteria. If there is no synthetic liver cell failure and if the child is less than 4 months of age, if the child is less than 5 months of age, I would recommend that you go ahead with the Kasai operation, especially in an experienced center. Now, does age affect the outcome of Kasai? This is a very difficult question to answer. The popular teaching, what we like to tell the pediatricians, and I'm not changing that track, what we like to tell the pediatricians is refer as early as possible, because earlier the better, outcome is better. But really, it is not the age of the child that makes a difference to the outcome, it is the duration of biliary atresia. So if this child was in utero and the biliary atresia started at that point and the child was born with jaundice and never really cleared jaundice, even though you may operate at 30 days of age, that child has had biliary atresia for a lot longer than 30 days. So the outcome there is not going to be affected by age. Similarly, there may be a child who is 120 days old. That child developed jaundice when the child was 1 month old. So in that child, biliary atresia lasted only for 90 days. In which case, that means the biliary atresia is only, the duration of biliary atresia is only 90 days, so the outcome is likely to be good, although the age of the child is 120 days. I hope you understand me clearly. Now, there's another confounding factor here, preterm babies. Preterm babies may come with biliary atresia at 150 days of age, but if their corrected gestational age is less than 120, the success of Kasai is very, very good, although their age is 150 days. So it's a duration of biliary atresia that's important, not the age at Kasai portoenterostomy. It's a duration of biliary atresia that affects the outcome, not age. So there are multiple papers which say that age does not affect the prognosis of Kasai portoenterostomy. But please don't tell pediatricians this. I want them to refer patients as early as possible to us, because clearly the outcome is better the younger the baby is. Less than 30 days, the outcome is 80% success. 30 to 90 days is around 60 to 70%, and more than 90 days, the outcome drops to less than 60%. What are the other factors that affect the outcome of Kasai portoenterostomy? The serum bilirubin. We are beginning to see that more and more in our patients. The higher the bilirubin at the time of diagnosis, the worse the outcome. The APRI index. APRI index is something the adult hepatologists have been using for a really long time to stage cirrhosis, adult cirrhosis. The same thing when done in children. The higher the APRI index also seems to be, the more the fibrosis, the worse the outcome. Now, the degree of cirrhosis and fibrosis at presentation in some studies correlates with outcome, not in all studies, but in every single study, surgical experience correlates with outcome. If you are doing more than 5 Kasais per year, the outcome is better than a surgeon who is doing less than 5 Kasais per year. Untreated cholangitis, the outcome is worse. Biliary atresia splenic malformation, the outcome is worse. CMV, the outcome is actually better. Now, coming to CMV biliary atresia, I want to talk to you about this because this is new. This is new in the clinical scenario. In the lab, they've known this for a really long time. In animal experiment models, they have known that they create animal experimental models by exposing rats to viruses. Usually they use rotavirus or reovirus. Now, they've been doing that for a really long time, and now we know that in children, viral etiology is very important and may be the cause for biliary atresia. It also points to an acquired nature for biliary atresia, and that is why you see a seasonal clustering. Now, in the summer months, we hardly ever see any biliary atresia. That is because there is seasonal clustering, and a lot of studies have hinted about this. Common viruses, CMV, which is the most important, Rota, Rio, and EBV. Now, CMV biliary atresia is a separate subgroup of biliary atresia. The children are older at presentation. Please remember that the CMV infection does not come from the mother. It is acquired by the infant, and these children are at least 3 weeks old when they get CMV infection. So they're older at presentation. The bilirubin is higher. There is increased inflammation and fibrosis. There is less likelihood of them clearing jaundice. There is higher incidence of cholangitis after KPE. So initially, when CMV biliary atresia was identified, and this was subclassified as a separate group, they thought the outcome was worse because the disease progresses rapidly, bilirubin is high, there is more fibrosis, there is less likelihood of clearing jaundice. However, this is how you diagnose CMV, by the way. You do a urinary CMV PCR test. And then, however, if you treat these babies with oral valganciclovir or IV valganciclovir, the outcome is better than non-CMV biliary atresia. So hear me out, please. CMV biliary atresia is a bad thing. The livers get damaged very rapidly, but that damage is reversible provided you identify the child as CMV and treat with oral Valgan cyclopentine. Now, in our institution, we've been doing this now for the last 32 babies in this. We started in this series of 105 patients. So, Group A are babies who are urinary CMV positive. All of them were treated with oral postoperative Valgan cyclovir for 3 to 6 weeks until the CMV PCR became negative. So, we repeated a CMV PCR in 3 weeks and another one in 6 weeks, and until the PCR turned negative, we continued with Valgan cyclovir and also steroids. We did not stop the steroids. We monitored them weekly with the CBC and urea and creatinine while on Valgan cyclovir. Group B was children who were urinary CMV negative and they had routine postoperative care. All patients received steroids. The results: the jaundice clearance in CMV biliary atresia was 71%, despite the age, despite the higher grades of fibrosis. Children were older, the children had more fibrosis, bad livers, but yet the jaundice clearance was 71%. Long-term outcome of Kasai: 80% of all children with biliary atresia will need a liver transplant. That is the number we need to focus on. We need to bring that down to, 30, 40, 50%. Because the better our Kasai is, the better the outcome will be. The better our identification of the etiology of biliary atresia is, the more we intervene at that stage and halt it we attack the etiopathogenesis of disease, the better our outcome will be. Now, why is CMV so important? Because after the Kasai also the disease progresses. Please understand that. I hate it when people say the Kasai has failed. The Kasai has not failed. The liver disease has progressed. The liver disease progresses. The etiology of pathogenesis of biliary atresia continues. That inflammatory cascade, the fibrotic cascade, continues to be active even after Kasai and tracheostomy. This has been demonstrated by umpteen liver biopsy studies done in children after Kasai. So the liver disease continues to progress, and if you want to stop that, if you want to break that chain, you have to either give steroids or you have to attack the etiology, which is virus, and give Valgan cyclovir. So the more we start doing that, the more we understand the etiopathogenesis, the more we start treating the etiopathogenesis and doing good Kasai operations, the need for liver transplantation will reduce, and I hope we can bring this in my lifetime. I hope we can see that this number of 80% decreases to 40 or 50%. Even now, 45% of children will reach teenage years with their own livers. 15% will have a truly long-term symptom-free life. Even though the liver histology may be abnormal, they will have a symptom-free life. Now, in most centers, children with biliary atresia are alive because of these two people: Morio Kasai, who dared to do the Kasai operation, who dared to come out and teach the world how to do a Kasai operation, and because of Thomas Tarsal, because he dared to do liver transplantation in children with biliary atresia despite all odds. That concludes my talk. If you have, are we doing questions, or how do you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Priya. That was a wonderful talk on biliary atresia. I'm sure it will stimulate all the young surgeons. And you've given one etiology on why the biliary atresia progresses in spite of a successful Kasai, the viral etiology, cytomegalovirus. Because that still remains an enigma. Why after a successful Kasai, why does the disease progress? We don't have the answers for that. The transplant has come in the last 2 decades, and that has sort of sorted out the problem for those who can afford it and go to the centers where it is done. Any questions from the audience? We can take 1 or 2 questions, I'm sure.
So I think the audience can put their questions in the chat box.
And thank you. We had a wonderful session. We thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to share such an important topic of interest to all pediatric surgeons. And the dismal results of biliary atresia are definitely better. It just shows that if young pediatric surgeons, like what Dr. Priya has done, concentrate on one disease, do large numbers, then surely your results will improve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bhagiji. Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bagri sir. And thanks a lot to you, Dr. Priya ma'am, for such an informative talk. And now we'll move on to the next session, which is talk on esophageal replacement. The chair for the this session is Dr. Prema Menon ma'am, who is the professor at PGI Chandigarh, and the speaker is Dr. Vireshwar Bhatnagar sir, who is a former head of the pediatric surgery department at AIIMS New Delhi and is currently dean at Sharda University, Greater Noida. Good morning, good afternoon, Dr. Bhatnagar sir, and we have made you the co-host, so you can start sharing your screen.
So, is my screen visible?
Yes, sir, you are visible.
And am I heard loud and clear?
Clearly, sir. Please go
Okay,
ahead.
good. So, thank you very much, Wadia team, for inviting me to speak on esophageal replacement. I hope to finish in time. I'll certainly try my best. It's a very long subject, and there are lots of nuances to it. So, firstly, before I start, I must make a differentiation between esophageal replacement and esophageal augmentation or esophageal elongation. So, we are primarily going to talk on esophageal replacement. I'm going to jump straight into the subject. I'm not going to spend time on the preoperative management before esophageal replacement because I don't think I have time for that. So I think I'll go straight ahead. How do I move my slide? Okay. So before we talk about esophageal replacement, I think we need to understand that the native esophagus is the best esophagus. And whatever the condition may be, we must try to retain that esophagus. In esophageal atresia, it's a different situation, but in acquired conditions like corrosive esophageal damage, you have lots of available, like dilatations, local mitomycin C applications, which help in preserving the native esophagus. So the replacement of the native esophagus should be the last ditch effort. Can I request everybody to mute themselves, please? Yeah, thank you. So there are a lot of techniques which are available for the esophageal replacement, and we will take them one by one. Before we take up the techniques, we must also understand there are multiple structures which can be used to replace the esophagus. We have the colon, we have the stomach, and we have the jejunum. So the colon is something which used to be very, very popular once upon a time. It still is, particularly in countries like Egypt, for example. But the stomach seems to be taking over the role of an esophageal replacement substitute. And this can either be in the form of a gastric tube, a tube made out of the stomach, or the stomach hole, which can be pulled up into the neck or into the mediastinum. The jejunum remains a good organ or tissue for esophageal replacement, possibly not so much in children, but in adults where the esophagus has to be sacrificed along with the stomach in cases of carcinoma. But in children, the jejunum has not found a place for replacement. The other thing which you must understand is that there are different routes in which the new esophagus can be placed. It can be placed in the subcutaneous tissue, it can be placed retrosternally, or it could be placed in the orthotopic position, which is prevertebral. So there is a very nice autopsy study done quite some time back in Israel, and they demonstrated that the orthotopic route, which is the mediastinal route or the prevertebral route, uses up the shortest length of the required esophageal replacement. So that is something which you need to consider, but it's not always possible to use this route, and therefore sometimes we have to use the retrosternal route or the subcutaneous route, and in this situation, the new esophagus needs to be slightly longer than the neoesophagus which you would use in the orthotopic position. So, as far as pediatric surgeons are concerned, I think there are primarily two main reasons for which you need to replace the esophagus. One is esophageal atresia, and the other is corrosive esophageal stricture or corrosive esophageal damage. Now, in esophageal atresia, you must understand there are multiple ways of treating esophageal atresia. The reason for which you need to do an esophageal replacement are the reasons where you would have to do a cervical and abdominal esophagostomy or a cervical esophagostomy and gastrostomy. And this can be because of a number of reasons like leaks and damage to the esophagus, or in pure esophageal atresia with long gaps, and so on. In corrosive esophageal injuries, the primary reason for doing esophageal replacement is either because of a refractory to dilatation, or there has been such destructive damage to the esophagus that it cannot be used, or there is failed local dissection. So these are some of the reasons why the esophagus needs to be replaced. We'll go straight into the various techniques of esophageal replacement. Just before I start that, I would like to mention that we had published this paper some time back, and this was our technique of esophageal diversion in cases where, particularly in cases of esophageal atresia. So instead of making a standard gastrostomy in the stomach and retaining the lower esophageal stump, we dissect the lower esophageal stump and bring it out as an abdominal esophagostomy. And the reason for that is very simple. When you look at the patient, you find that the abdominal skin is absolutely healthy, and there is no evidence of gastric acid effects on the abdominal skin. So this is how you would do the gastric tube, reverse gastric tube esophageal replacement. This is the cervical esophagostomy. This is the abdominal esophagostomy, or the gastrostomy if you want to call it. And you begin mobilization both at these two places. And after you have mobilized, you clear the space either retrosternally or in the mediastinum by a combination of blunt and sharp dissection. And you pass your fingers above and below to make sure that the entire space has been nicely dissected and it's free. And you take a catheter or whatever, silk thread or whatever, and measure the distance which you need to cover in order to make your gastric tube. Then you bring the stomach out into the operative field. You make sure that the gastroepiploic arcade is complete. You might have to put clamps on either side to make sure that the vascularity remains okay. And then you start constructing the reverse gastric tube, beginning from the antrum region, going upwards towards the fundus. I usually use, depending on the size of the patient, I would use a size 22 or 24 Malikoff's catheter and make the tube around that. I use diathermy to make these incisions, otherwise the bleeding can be pretty nasty. And once you have cut the stomach tube out, you start the stitching. My preferred method of stitching is a double layer stitching with Vicryl 30 or 40, or sometimes 50 if the child is too small. I would put a stitch along the mucosa first, only the mucosa, and then close the muscle separately over the mucosa. So I do not invert the tissue in between, because I've realized that by inverting the tissue in between, you lose a lot of caliber of the neoesophagus, and you stitch the stomach back in position. So you have a nice, reasonable length of the esophageal tube, and you have enough of stomach along with pylorus remaining in the abdominal cavity. Now this, I think, is very important when you look at the future growth and development of these children. So the neck anastomosis is done. It's a spatulated anastomosis, so that you triangulate the upper end of the esophagus, so that even if there is some degree of fibrosis in the healing process, it does not cause a stenosis, and it's an oblique anastomosis. At the end of the operation, you have a gastrostomy tube, you have a feeding jejunostomy tube, you have a mediastinal vein, and you have an abdominal vein, and the incision is closed in the midline using subcuticular stitches, so that you end up with a nice cosmetic scar. So, leak is one of the most dreaded problems with the reverse gastric tube or with any gastric tube, because there's a very long suture line. But if you're careful, then you avoid the leaks. And particularly, what you need to be extremely careful is the entire suture line, which is going to be in the mediastinum, because a leak here can be very difficult to manage. Small leaks in the neck, for example, they can easily be managed conservatively or with a minor procedure later on. But a leak in the mediastinum can be difficult to manage. Now, this is just to show you that this is the retrosternal root and this is the mediastinal root. But the beauty of the esophageal, of the gastric tube is that you get a nice cylindrical lumen which looks like a tube. And this is where the reason for doing it by hand cutting and hand stitching is important, because here you can make it absolutely cylindrical. When you use staplers, you must understand that staplers are linear structures, they are not curved structures. And therefore, when you're making the cuts with the staplers, you start with, you put it on from both above and below, and therefore you have a wider lumen on top and a wider lumen here, and in between, where the two ends of the staplers meet, the lumen is slightly small. That is called wasting in the WAISTING, wasting effect in the neoesophagus, and this can produce complications later on. So between 84 and 2011, I'm sorry, the data is slightly old, we have this series of 31 cases for both esophageal atresia, corrosive injuries, and some other reasons. And you will see that the choice of esophageal replacement, at least in my hands, has been the reverse gastric tube. In situations where reverse gastric tube was not possible, or as in one case where it had to be abandoned, we have also used the colon and the gastric pull-up, and these two techniques we'll talk about in a little while. It is very important to evaluate what you have done. And I think both from your point of view and the patient's point of view, everybody will be happy if you look at what you have done and how what you have done is progressing and behaving. So in the post-operative period, we would do a water-soluble contrast study to see a leak or a stricture. At 1 month, we would do a barium swallow to look at how the tube looks like, look at the stricture formation or not, look at the transit. Feeding and swallowing has to be monitored, weight gain has to be monitored, chest symptoms have to be monitored. We do nuclear scans to evaluate for gastroesophageal reflux, esophageal transition, and gastric outlet obstruction. Manometry is something which is not absolutely necessary, but if you have it, you get a very nice idea of what the pressure differences are and how the swallowing is behaving in the neoesophagus. So there are obviously any surgical procedures would have complications, and reverse gastric tube is no exception. It also has complications, but they're not. Most of them are mild and self-limiting and can be managed very easily. We published this paper sometime back on the post-operative long-term follow-up, and we used 3 basic parameters. Physical development, where we found that there was no significant difference between patients of esophageal atresia and patients of corrosive esophageal strictures. So growth and development usually proceeded normally. We looked at post-operative imaging of the esophagus, and most of the cases, in almost all the cases, the new esophagus looked nice and normal in caliber and configuration. In a few cases, we found that there was some problems with the imaging, which showed that there may be ulcerations or outpouching in the tube which you have fashioned from the stomach. But it did not cause any problems in the functionality. The post-operative functional evaluation was done using manometry, 24-hour pH monitoring, and radionuclide scans. And this is good because it places you in a better position to understand the symptoms which the patient may present to you in the post-operative period. And therefore, these studies can tell you exactly as to why those symptoms are occurring, and you are better equipped to handle the management in the post-operative period. So in conclusion, we found that the reverse gastric tube was effective, and this is my preferred method of replacing the esophagus. Now we'll look at some of the other techniques. We'll stay on the stomach and look at the isoperistaltic gastric tube. This is something which one of my colleagues, Professor Bajpai, it is his preferred method of treatment. It's more or less the procedure is the same, except that the direction of the tube is different. The reverse gastric tube, you will begin the tube here. In the isoperistaltic gastric tube, you will begin the tube here. The important issue here is that if you use staplers, and as you can see here, Professor Bajpai uses staplers, you end up wasting a lot of tissue, and the amount of stomach which remains tends to become very small. And there is a narrow wasting in the middle of the reconstructed gastric tube. The advantage of this is that because it's an isoperistaltic tube, you don't have to flip this tube over, but because by flipping the tube over, you can actually end up producing a little obstruction at the point where the tube has been flipped over the native stomach. So here it is straight, and the tube opens directly into the antral region. So these are some of the basic differences between the reverse gastric tube and the isoperistaltic tube. Now, this method has also been evaluated post-operatively. The same principles apply as far as the root of the new esophagus is concerned. Same methods have been used for the functional evaluation, barium swallow, manometry, and technetium scans. There again, I mean, it's something which, if you have it, you do it. If you don't have it, I mean, there's nothing which prevents you from doing the surgery. But if you have these investigations available, you are in a much better position to understand what's happening post-operatively. So growth and development, again, there was no significant difference in the isoperistaltic tube esophageal replacement group also. So we'll now go up to the gastric pull-up. Here in gastric pull-up, there is no tube fashioned out of the stomach. The entire stomach is mobilized on its pedicle and pulled up through the mediastinum or the retrosternal space into the neck, or the anastomosis can even be done in the mediastinum. So here you can see that the stomach has been mobilized completely. This is the fundus, this is the pyloric end, and the entire stomach has been pulled up. The anastomosis is not done to the stump of the esophagus, but the anastomosis is done to the fundus, because this may not reach into the neck, but this fundus, when you pull up, can reach into the neck very easily. So as you can see here, the entire stomach can easily reach into the neck. There are advantages, there are disadvantages. The one advantage is that there is only one anastomosis, which is either in the neck or in the mediastinum. The stomach usually has good blood supply, and therefore the risk of necrosis or anastomotic leak or stricture formation is poor. Pylorus can at times give a lot of problems, so there's a lot of difference of opinion whether a pyloroplasty should be done at the first sitting or it can wait. lots of surgeons prefer to do a pyloroplasty or a pyloromyotomy at the time of the stomach pull-up. The disadvantages are that it occupies a large space in the chest, and this can cause significant respiratory compromise. The gastric acid is going straight up into the neck. The chances of gastroesophageal reflux are very high, particularly if the pylorus is not functioning adequately. And vagotomy may lead to features of dumping. So this is a technique which is most favored by my colleague Dr. D.K. Gupta, and this was his preferred technique. So between various people, we postgraduates were privileged to see and manage reverse gastric tube, isoperistaltic gastric tube, gastric transposition, and colonic transposition off and on. So here again, the indications are the same. The advantage of the gastric pull-up is that it can be done in the neonatal period. You don't have to do any temporary diversion. But even if you have done a temporary diversion, you can still use the stomach to pull up. There are concerns, there are complications. Concern is that pyloromyoplasty may be required. Retrosternal route is a little more difficult in stomach pull-up, and therefore most people would pull the stomach up in the retrosternal route. Feeding jejunostomies or TPN would be required, whatever technique you use. Post-operative ventilation is a little more difficult in gastric transposition rather than in gastric tubes. Ischemia to fundus is rare. Compression in the neck is also not very common. But complications occur like in every other gastric, any other esophageal replacement technique. Maybe you could read this paper as well, because this is also published and all this data is in the public domain. The motility and pressure studies again have been done almost similar to the other tubes, and with the nucleus scans or the manometry or the imaging studies, you can see the flow pattern. You can look at whether there is any obstruction or not. You can look at pressures inside the stomach, which has been pulled up, and you can look at the emptying and the transit through the stomach. When you look at the world literature, I think the person who has the maximum experience of gastric pull-up is Louis Spitz. I mean, he was at Roy Thomas Sleep. I think he's retired now, and he possibly has the largest series. He did not report any graft failures. There was mortality, and anastomotic leaks were present, and anastomotic strictures were also present. Although he did not report any problems with the growth and development, but subsequently, I think a lot of people have tried stomach pull-ups, and a lot of people have described that there is a slight but slightly significant degree of growth retardation. Otherwise, it works very well. Now, as far as the stomach pull-up is concerned, I'll towards the end of my talk, I'll also give you some modifications which the gastric transposition technique has been done. Colon transposition is the fourth major procedure which is practiced internationally. We have limited experience because we have usually used colon transposition as a secondary procedure if the other possibilities are not there, or if the other possibilities have failed. So our numbers of colonic transposition are much less, but you must understand the anatomy of the colon to figure out as to which part of the colon would be required for doing the esophageal replacement. So you have three major vessels: the ileocolic artery, the middle colic artery, and the left colic artery. And this gives you there are three possibilities of colonic segments which can be used to replace the esophagus, right? So again, the colon can be pulled up either in the paravertebral or the orthotopic position, or it can go up in the retrosternal region. The anastomosis, there will be three anastomosis. There will be one anastomosis to bring the continuity of the colon. There will be one anastomosis in the neck and one anastomosis in the colon with the stomach. So the number of anastomoses is more with colonic transposition. So this is one of the disadvantages of colonic transposition. The advantages are that it is a very robust structure, and therefore it can withstand a lot of handling and other things. The problem with colon is that it has the propensity to become redundant, and this is where it's a touch and go effort when you're making the conduit to be pulled up into the neck, and it is reliant only on one blood vessel. So if there is a twist or a damage or a compression of that one vessel, you can end up losing the entire graft. So that is one of the major disadvantages of the colon. So like I said, I mean, the Egyptians have the maximum experience with colon transposition. They have done it primarily for corrosive esophageal damage. And like I said, I mean, redundancy is a problem. The emptying has to be done by gravity, so the individual has to feed in the upright position. Ulcerations are common. Iron deficiency anemias can be common. Vitamin deficiencies can be common. And one of the biggest problems is that it cannot be used if the patient also has an anorectal malformation, because there the use of the colon would be entirely for the anorectal malformation and especially not for the esophageal replacement. And if the child has something like a short bowel colon, then the entire colon is like a cyst, and you may not have colonic tissue to bring to replace the esophagus. All that cyst will be converted into a tube, or the ileum would be used to reconstruct the colon and the anorectal malformation. So I mentioned that there are other procedures. Some of them have been, most of them have been described here in our country. This is a technique which was described by Dr. Satish Agarwal, who was earlier in Maulana Azad and is now with the Ganga Ram Hospital. So here he disconnects the stomach from the duodenum, pulls it up into the neck, and does an anastomosis between the upper esophagus and the pharynx with the stomach, and uses a jejunal conduit to bridge the gap between the stomach and the jejunum. So this is something which I think he did out of necessity because nothing else was available. But I doubt whether it will form a preferred method of replacing the esophagus. Dr. Satish Agarwal's second modification or innovation was that when he was pulling the stomach up to obviate the problems of this large volume in the mediastinum or in the chest, he did a reduction of the stomach using a stapler. So instead of a large volume, he had a slightly more tubular stomach, which was pulled into the mediastinum and taken up to the neck. So this was again something which I think has not gained too much acceptance, because I don't think too many people have tried it, but it looks promising. Now, Charlie described a procedure and Dr. Kailan Rao described a procedure. These procedures are essentially esophageal elongation or esophageal augmentation. These are typically or by definition not esophageal replacement, but these are some of the techniques which can be used when the esophagus needs to be replaced. So, and How much time do I have?
Sir, 5 minutes to go.
Okay, so I'll run through this. See, I purposely did not bring in the pre-operative management because I thought that is something which most people who are familiar with diverting the esophagus would be familiar with. But in esophageal replacement, I think post-operative management is extremely important. And there are several aspects to it. I mean, you have the nursing aspect, you have the management aspect, you have the imaging aspects, and various other things. We'll discuss, take them up one by one. Thing is important. You put the patient in a semi-reclining position so that there is less of pulling in whatever the tissue you've taken up to replace the esophagus. Now, mittens is something which we often forget, and the child actually pulls out some of the tubes and creates a problem, not just for himself, but for the people who are looking after that child. So, I think mittens are something which you should not forget, and every child who's had this major operation where multiple tubes are there should be given. Because, as I said, I mean, there are a lot of catheters and tubes. You know, in the initial immediate post-operative period, you'll have an endotracheal tube, you'll have a gastric tube, you have an IV line, you have 2-3 drains, a drain in the neck, a drain in the abdomen, a drain in the mediastinum, you have a urinary catheter, and you'll have a gastrostomy or a jejunostomy. So there are too many catheters in the immediate post-operative period, and you need to look after these. Monitoring is important because you need to monitor the heart rate, the respiratory rate, the blood pressure, the temperature, the intake output, and oxygen saturation. This is extremely important. Management, you have to look at the fluid requirements, the nutrition requirements, ventilatory support, medication, and investigations. So fluids, we begin with crystalloids in the immediate post-operative periods. We can add colloids. We can replace blood or blood products if necessary and use plasma if necessary. Particularly if the child is undernourished, then I think a few doses of or aliquots of plasma can be used to build up the not just the colloid pressure but also the plasma, also the proteins. Nutrition, parenteral, I mean, you're replacing the esophagus to do enteral nutrition, but in the immediate post-operative period, till such time that the tube gets finalized or the jejunostomy or the gastrostomy becomes functional, you may need to give a short span of parenteral nutrition. Ventilatory support is very important, and I think we should do it electively. You can do it as intermittently mandatory ventilation, maybe for about 24 hours. Switch over to CPAP before you take the patient on mask or nasal prongs and later on room air. Medication is multi-pronged. You need antibiotics to prevent or to treat infections. Pain relief is absolutely important because if you don't relieve the pain, the child will be disturbed and the child will be very uncomfortable. So the choice of method is paracetamol. NSAIDs and opioids are usually not preferred. It can be given as intramuscular, not intravenous. Later on, it can be given enterally. We have used epidural catheter very frequently, and I think this gives an excellent post-operative period. The only problem is that as long as the epidural pain relief is being given, you need to keep the urinary catheter in. Specific, I write, because there are some situations, particularly in gastric pull-up, where the cardiac rhythm may be disturbed, and that is where you need specific medication for that, and it's usually beta blockers which help in managing it. We need to keep a check on the blood chemistry, on the acid-base balance, imaging and cultures, with the slightest suspicion of infection. Now, post-operative problems can happen either with the conduit or which can happen anyways. So the problems with the conduit I've almost described as and when we were talking about the different conduits being used. General, I mentioned cardiopulmonary, which is more often seen with the stomach pull-up. Abdominal and gastrointestinal, again, are problems. Again, acute gastric dilatation is a problem. Dysmotility may be a problem. Ileus and distension may be a problem. In the immediate post-operative period, pooling of saliva may be a problem. And the child's anxiety has to be relieved. And the best way of relieving it is to make the child pain-free. Having talked about the various tissues available in the body or internationally in this aspect, and these are again at the moment quite experimental, because both animal studies and human studies have been done on various kinds of tissues and chemicals and various kinds of materials, which have been done in animals and in humans, almost all over the world. Much of it is being done in Europe as compared to the other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you very much for this informative talk. And because we are running behind the schedule, I'll request everybody to post their questions on the chat box. And thank you, Dr. Prema Menon, ma'am. Yeah, if Prema Menon, ma'am, if you want to comment something or ask some question.
Prema, you will have to unmute yourself.
No, it was muted from the other side. Actually, thank you very much, sir, for an excellent talk. I just wanted to comment briefly that very easy to do, I mean, comparatively easy to do in a pure atresia. But once we come to a esophageal atresia with leak, like a TEF with leak, or a corrosive stricture, or a redo esophageal replacement, then it's a completely different ball game. And many times we have to do a thoracotomy also. And even the complications and morbidity increases much more. So I think, of course, you would have had a lot of experience with that, but I just thought that it's not always that we can just do the dissection from above and below. And we may, for safety's sake, it may be better to do a thoracotomy in some cases.
So I might add, if Gayatri permits, we have restricted thoracotomies primarily to corrosive injuries, and there's a reason for that. In a lot of situations where we thought that we were going in for an esophageal replacement, if you do a thoracotomy, you sometimes find that the stricture was not as long as what was appearing on the imaging, and you can actually get away with a local resection. So I distinctly offhand remember at least 4 or 5 children where we went in with the idea of doing esophageal replacement, but we came away with just doing a local resection and not replacing the esophagus. So that is one big advantage of thoracotomy in corrosive strictures. In esophageal atresia, even with redos, what we have experienced is that there is almost a gap of a year between the initial surgery and the esophageal replacement. And that 1 year gap is enough to restore the integrity of the tissues. The fibrosis is not too significant. And with a combination of blunt and sharp resection, you can easily create that space in the posterior mediastinum.
Yeah, very well said, sir. Even we had the similar experience wherein they went in with the intention of replacement and ended up with a dissection and anastomosis. Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And
thank you so much.
So since we are running behind the schedule, we'll not have the lunch break and we'll directly progress on to the next session, which is a panel discussion on the liver transplant. The speakers for this panel discussion are Dr. Shashank Kshotriya, Dr. Sanjay Rao, and Dr.